Hi, everyone. Welcome to Speak Mentorship's speaker series. Our speaker for today is Dr. Connie Chung, and she's joining us from California. And I'm going to hand it over to her to talk more about the importance of getting involved and awakening your passions. So, Dr. Connie Chung, please take it away.
Hi, this is Dr. Chung. So I work for an anti-sex trafficking organization called MISSY. And what they do is that they work with commercially and sexually exploited youth. Um, our youngest client is quite young, and then it goes up to age 24. So we also work with girls who are at risk for being sex trafficked, for example, the homeless or girls who have a history of being sexually molested. And so we target them through the assessment center, which targets abused children, as well as juvenile justice centers and foster care. So that's the kind of work we do. I do work with the transitional age youth, which is 16 to 24-year-old girls to young women. I also work with transgender youth and youth with schizophrenia, disabilities, other disabilities like cerebral palsy, and that's the kind of work I do. At night, I teach at a seminary, and I volunteer extensively at a homeless shelter, and I'll talk more about that later on. So I think that, I was asked to talk about passions and pursuing your passions. I think we hear about that a lot, and it's kind of a trite thing to say. However, I really think that when I made a very drastic career change from being a consultant to working in philanthropy, I really had to think about the following questions. What did you enjoy doing as a child? 2, if money were no object, what would you do and why? 3, if you could identify your personal hero or mentor, whose career would you most want to emulate? I think that's really important because there were people that I definitely admired in my social network, and I'll talk a lot about social networking and pursuing philanthropy full time later on. But I think that there may be people that have idealized traits or qualities that you're looking for, and so speaking to them could be quite helpful. I have a personal mentor who was the executive director of a very large homeless shelter. What are your strengths? What activities and subjects do you seem to excel at? And you could talk to a career counselor. Earlier, I talked about leveraging social media. So social media, a lot of it can be like nonsense, but a lot of it can also be a force for good. I use social media extensively to talk about homelessness, disability, mental illness, and sex trafficking. Sometimes I've also talked about prison work and prison ministries. You can leverage social media by connecting with other people who share your areas of interest. You can read blogs, you can join forums, you can find out what it's like to do things you love. So the benefits of volunteering, giving back to your community are pretty extensive. And so I think that it's really given me a network of friends that I consider, some of whom I consider family now. These social connections are very valuable. And because a lot of people who volunteer a lot tend to be self-selective. They're people who like to give back, who like to give to philanthropy, who like to take care of other people. There's a lot of community of empathy going on. And so I find that the people that I meet volunteering are some of the nicest people I've ever met. And it helps you explore your likes and dislikes. So, a lot of the audience is high school aged, and you're a youth, or maybe a young adult, woman or man. And so if you are a youth or a young woman, I think that volunteering can give you something to enhance your resume because you may lack professional work experience or just have a few jobs. And it can give you like a way to get into the swimming pool of what it is that you desire to pursue without the drawbacks of having a rigid schedule. So you can balance school and volunteering as well as your part-time job if you have one. There's been a lot of talk about being competitive for college admissions through volunteering, and I'm going to talk more about that a little later. And service learning has been associated with academic gain. So especially with complex situations in volunteering, what you learn in the classroom can be very theoretical. But when you do stuff like when I go to a prison or when I go to a homeless shelter or when I have to do street-based work with sex trafficking victims, like after, say, a sting happened and we find some girls that have been sexually exploited, I have to apply a lot of things I learned in theory in my psychology classes to the practical world, even if I'm volunteering or working in it. There's also a sense of increased self-efficacy. I think it helps you identify your core competencies and skills. And I talked about skill building and expanding learning beyond the classroom, because I really do think that it's given me a kind of education that goes beyond the classroom. And sometimes it leads to scholarship because it builds a network of people some of whom could be your mentors and write you letters of recommendation. Some community service organizations offer their own scholarship opportunities if they're a larger organization, as well as team building experience. Volunteering is often done in teams with groups of people. Now, it could be a small team, it could be a large team, and I think that it's taught me different skills associated with working well with other people. And I think the core benefit of volunteering is not just to make you feel better about helping someone else. I think it's developed compassion and empathy. And so Daniel Goldman identified 5 key elements of empathy. Number 1, he says, empathy involves understanding others. This is perhaps what most people understand by empathy. You sense other people's feelings and perspectives, and you take an active interest in their concerns. You develop others. You help them with their needs and concerns and help them develop to their full potential. You have a service orientation by serving other people. Leveraging diversity. I think that was interesting, that empathy actually provides opportunities to connect and build bridges with different kinds of people that may be different from yourself, racially, ethnically, religiously, gender-wise, sexual orientation-wise, or disability status or age-wise. I think that when you volunteer and you give back to your community, you often build bridges with people that you otherwise may not have been in contact with. For example, when I help lead teams to volunteer for the homeless, most of my volunteers have never been homeless. They've obviously seen homeless people on the street. They're concerned about homelessness, otherwise they wouldn't volunteer, but they themselves have never had an extended engagement with a homeless person. So I think it shows them a diverse life experience that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, and that deepens empathy. And political awareness. The word political can sometimes come across as being political, being manipulative and strategic, but it also means sensing and responding to a group's undercurrents and power relationships. When you give back to the community, you often have to negotiate people in different places of power. For example, I'll do stuff with celebrities sometimes or politicians, and these people are change makers in a different way. I don't think that anyone who is in high school or a young college student is any less powerful in that regard, but I mean, they may have a social capital they develop from their professional relationships. And so being political sometimes in terms of empathy, you learn how to navigate organizations and learn how to achieve certain steps. So a lot of you, I was told, were young high school women and youth. And I think that obviously a big priority for you guys is college admissions. To tell you a bit about myself, I went to UC Berkeley for college, and then I graduated as class commencement speaker. And then I went to Harvard University for 2 master's degrees and a doctorate. And I've noticed that the climate of applying to college is a lot more competitive now than when I did it. However, I did go to a fairly competitive high school through the busing system, and I think that it was pretty hard for me to get into college. And I'll tell you more of my personal story why that would be. So I think that when you create, I've been on admissions committees where I read people's essays. I've never made the final decision on an admission, but I've been passed an essay to review, a statement of purpose. And so the way I see philanthropy as it applies to your college admissions essay is that you want to create a portfolio where your academics, your extracurricular activities, and your community service, it creates this clear, coherent picture to admissions officers about who you are, what your values are, what you stand for, and what you want to pursue. Now, that's a tall order for a young person. I mean, I'm much older, and yet I can't tell you specifically the answers to all those questions. However, I think that giving back to my community has definitely strengthened my vision of what it is I want to pursue and what values I stand for. And so when you create that portfolio for yourself, I think I'm going to tell you more about some hints about volunteering as it applies to your statement of purpose later on. So in a study cited by the Huffington Post, there's an organization that I'll cite later called Do Something, and encourages young people to volunteer and contribute to their communities. So they surveyed admissions officers from 32 of the top universities in the country, ranked by US News World and Report. And 70% of those respondents said they prefer to see a student who sticks with one cause, not one who has a laundry list of volunteer opportunities. So I think if you just have like this whole list of so many places you volunteered, it can come across that you just do it to get into college, or that you did it like once or twice. You don't have a real commitment to it. So I think it's much more powerful to have a long-term passionate commitment to a few causes or one cause than to have a lot of volunteer opportunities. But I will talk about short-term volunteer opportunities too. I took one. I did a short-term work at an orphanage in Mexico City. And that was a very valuable experience, even though it was only for like less than a month. So I think when it comes to short-term versus long-term commitments to volunteering, I think, again, it's better to have a cause and a coherent vision of what you're volunteering for rather than having a lot of volunteer experiences here and there. But if you're going to do short-term stuff, you can write about it in your statement of purpose. But as it affects how it's changed you, what it's taught you, or maybe it was a very unusual experience. Like I know I have a friend who led a project of building wells in Kenya. And she had some very enthusiastic young people go for like a week to build wells in Kenya, like a week or 2 weeks tops. But that's such like a life-changing experience that I wouldn't be surprised if some of them wrote about it. And when you write about it, don't just write, I did this, I did this, I did this. You write some kind of personal, meaningful reflection about how the volunteering experience changed or affected you. And if you've already volunteered at a lot of things short term, at least try to show a running theme. So maybe, I've done all this for people who are homeless, or I've done all this for people who are disabled, or for animal rights, etc. So I talked about reflecting deeply and meaningfully about your experience. Avoid writing that a volunteer project was mandatory or required. Even if it was, sorry about that. Even if it was, you don't have to lie and say it wasn't. Don't do that. But I don't think you should focus on the fact that it was required by your school for credits or something. I think you should focus on the experience, how it changed you, how it impacted you, how it changed, the way you see the world, what it taught you. So I'm in California, so I wanted to go briefly over the UC application. And some of you in different states may also be applying to UC schools. And I'll also talk about the common application for high school students. So the UC application, from what I have seen, the latest version, my version was very different. It was a while ago. But I think the most up-to-date version I've seen, there was a volunteer and community service section, and there was an extracurricular activity section. So what you do is you approximate the number of hours based on the years you've participated in the hours per week. There's another blank section for honors you've gained from the volunteer and extracurricular activities. So there's one section where it's like you talk about the hours and your commitment. The second section, you can kind of brag about what you've done in those community service or volunteer experiences. And they're both type-in blanks. So this gives you a lot of freedom in how you're going to word what you've done. And never lie on the application, but I think that you can use action verbs and really kind of, you're trying to sell yourself. You're trying to promote yourself and give them a vision of who it is that you are, because your application is, other than the interview, if you're granted an interview, is the only message you are sending these college admissions officers. So you really want to be careful and strategic in how you present yourself and your experiences. Now, the common application, it limits you to 10 activity slots, where you can record pretty much anything and everything you've done during high school. They ask you twice about not only how you participated, but how you excelled in the activity. So they first ask your position leadership, and later details, honors won, and accomplishments. So I would keep a running log of your volunteer and community service experiences, because especially if you've had a lot, you can forget, or if it was short term, you can forget. So you might want to keep like a notebook or an online notes where, you're like, spent 4 hours at the shelter, spent 3 hours at the animal rescue organization, whatever. You just want to keep a running log so that you can have an accurate assessment of what you've done and how much you've done it of. I talked about dosomething.org. I highly recommend that site. It encourages youth to take action on causes they care about. You can have volunteer matching services online. Your high school or your college often lists opportunities to volunteer and give back. And you can seek out community organizations like hospitals, schools, community centers, animal shelters, homeless shelters, etc. So when I was a youth, I found an animal rescue area. It was like a habitat for rescued animals. And I just really fell in love with the animals. And I actually went up to them and I spoke to one of the leaders there, and I got to build a duck pond, and I got to raise horses, baby horses and goats. It was something that I sought out. So, I told you briefly about the organization I work for. I'm going to tell you a little bit more of myself. And so I'm pretty open about this. I was homeless as a child and adolescent. And then when I can't remember exactly how old I was. I may have been like 25 or 26. I wrote an email to the homeless shelter and said, I know this is random, but I just want you to know how much you've changed my life. And they wrote me back immediately. And since then, I've been associated with something called the Covenant House California. I'm not exactly sure how old I was, but I was between my mid to late 20s when I started. And I've been an advocate for Covenant House California for quite a while now. But even before and after that, I've worked in different causes. I was an AIDS researcher in East Africa. I'll show you a photo in a minute. I worked with AIDS orphans and Maasai tribeswomen. And Maasai are semi-nomadic tribes people. And I was working with illiterate Maasai tribeswomen in Tanzania, Africa. And then I worked with AIDS orphans in Kenya and Tanzania. And I also traveled through various towns all over East Africa beyond that, and major cities like Dar es Salaam, Nairobi. I was an intern at a group home for juvenile offenders who were gang members. And so that was a very powerful and sometimes painful experience for me, because a lot of the gang members, I mean, I don't want to just identify them as gang members. Youth who were in gangs had tragic family stories, and they were victims of extreme violence. And they were acting out that violence, and they were members of gangs, partially to have like a surrogate family, a substitute family for the family that they felt they lost. And it taught me a lot. Then I worked with toddlers who were addicted to drugs from fetal transmission. So what that means is that I was working with toddlers who were, maybe their moms took drugs while they were pregnant with them. And so they were literally born addicted to drugs, these babies and toddlers. It was very sad. A lot of them had neurological disorders and developmental disorders. And so people are like, well, how do you teach toddlers? Well, I help them with behavior management and motor development, because some of them had difficulty with motor skills because they had these neurological brain disorders from being born addicted. And then I did work with special education for adolescents with cognitive disabilities. And one of the reasons I'm really into working with the disabled is I have an unusual family. This happened later in life, though. Well, my brother happened earlier. My oldest brother contracted a rare disease and became severely brain damaged. And later on, my mom had a brain aneurysm. Basically, it's like something happened to her brain, and she became functionally deaf. And then my father had a massive stroke, and he became paralyzed. So I had this very unusual family of disability, and I myself have a disability. I'm born hearing impaired. When I'm actually the only person in my family born with a disability. All three other members, they developed it through accidents or illnesses. And I really felt like I learned a lot about disability and how it affects people. So I felt very compelled to give back. And I have a good relationship with my oldest brother, Donald. And so I started doing special education from a young age. I talked about my experience of working in Mexico City, Mexico, at an orphanage. And I'll tell you something, I don't speak Spanish. So people are like, well, how did you work in Mexico when you don't even speak Spanish? I told them that I don't speak Spanish. I don't know if this is the right site for me, but they were like, we need people to come to Mexico City at this orphanage. We have too many orphans and not enough volunteers, and they can't pay the staff. Will you do it? And I was like, of course I will. I just don't know how I'm going to communicate with the children. So that was a learning experience too about culture and language differences. I worked with very young children there. And so a lot of the things I used to communicate with the Mexican children was visual, or was primarily visual or activities like playing games with them, drawing with them, coloring with them. I even had a puppet show that, I did this hand puppet thing with the children, and I had a Spanish speaker narrate what I was trying to tell them through these puppets. And I found that the children respond much more to the puppets than to me. And so that was actually a way to get by without knowing Spanish. So I volunteered and conducted research with homeless children, homeless single mothers, and domestic violence survivors. So I did a lot of studies with homeless children in Boston, Massachusetts, and in LA, California. I was actually part of a National Institutes of Health Tri-City study. It was a very large study by a very major organization, and I ended up doing research with homeless youth and trauma. And then at another point, I was assigned at a domestic violence shelter, and a lot of the women were fleeing like really abusive relationships and marriages, and they were in the shelter with their children trying to start a new life and be protected. So Here's a picture of me working in Tanzania, Africa. Um, Now, these are some of the older youths. I didn't include a picture of the very young children because I didn't feel they had given me consent because they were too young to consent to a photo. So I only chose older children to share the pictures with you because they knew I would use this photo. And I don't like to use images of children without their consent. I don't like to feel like I'm exploiting them or, sometimes on Facebook, like you'll see someone like go to Africa and they're surrounded by these African kids and it just sends a message that we're like trying to save them. And so I'm very particular about the images I share with populations that are very vulnerable and the age group. So, for instance, I've never taken a picture of the toddlers I work with because they're just practically babies. Like they have no decision in that. So here I am sleeping outside to raise money for the homeless. I have done this 2 years in a row where I raise money for the homeless by sleeping outside. A lot of people are like, are you just playing homeless for one night? Well, obviously I'm not because I was homeless myself growing up. But I'll be honest with you, I've never slept outside until I did this event. I've slept in shelters, I've slept in cars, I've never slept on a sidewalk until this event. And I didn't realize how hard it would be. The ground was hard, it was cold, it was uncomfortable, it was really loud. Both years I barely slept, but I found the experience so meaningful because it really brought together people who really cared and had a heart for the homeless. And it raised a lot of money. In the end, we raised something like 7.1 million. The last figure I showed your organization was 6.8 million, but now I think it's like 7.1 million across many cities. So, I've talked a bit about my philanthropic experiences, and there are some more. I've worked for a while. I've been out of school for a while. Now I work with sex trafficking victims, which I talked about. And I've also worked with the severely mentally ill in different sectors, like people with schizophrenia, people with borderline personality disorder, people who have severe delusions about where they are or who they are. And that has its own set of challenges. I would not recommend that you volunteer with the severely mentally ill in high school. I don't even know if you would be allowed to. I think after you turn 18, if some of you are 18 and over, your college or an organization you work or volunteer for can help you make that decision. So I wouldn't recommend working with the severely mentally ill until you have a lot of experience working with people with very special needs. I was also an intern at an AIDS organization. I worked with HIV positive clients, and it was a really eye-opening experience because, I was this young woman and I was surrounded by people who mostly from the LGBT community. And that is not to say that, heterosexual people do not get HIV. It just happened to be that where the department I was working at the AIDS organization, there was a lot of LGBT clients. And a lot of them were quite ill by then. And so it really opened my eyes to the plight of people with HIV and full-blown AIDS. And it was sometimes hard to work with because I felt so bad for them. And yet there was also this sense of gratitude and community there that I've never experienced elsewhere. I've talked about my work with homeless youth. I've volunteered at a prison, and I've just gotten recently San Quentin prison. You may have heard of it. It's one of the most famous prisons in the United States. If you go on Netflix, they have documentaries about it. They said that I can work with prison inmates who are learning rehabilitation from violence. So I'll actually literally be working with people who've committed rape and murder. And I got a second thing recently where someone in my church who is a ex-inmate, he was actually incarcerated for a number of years, has asked me to help him with a program he's doing where people who have been incarcerated, who've been in prison and are re-entering society, adapt to society. Because it's very hard after you've been in prison. You have a record, employers don't want to hire you, and starting their life over after being incarcerated. So I've done a lot of work also with racial injustice and oppression, especially at Harvard. I did stuff with the Asian American community, Asian American alumni. I worked with various racial equality causes, such as I was the editor of a journal that addressed racial injustice in America and American schools. And I told you earlier about working at the animal care facility. So that concludes my talk. I think the highlights are really, I showed you, I talked a lot about my journey and the benefits of volunteering and how you can be competitive for college admissions. But I really think that it's about your journey. I'm just one person, and I want you to really put your feet in the water in terms of what you want to do. And it's okay to mess up. It's okay to make mistakes. Like when I was an intern at the group home for youth in gangs, I made a lot of mistakes because I did not know entirely what I was doing, and I did not know a lot about gangs. And I learned so much about gang culture and gang membership. And it was a trial by fire. And there's also something called compassion fatigue, where I've developed it sometimes, where I'm just so tired of taking care of people that it burns me out. So you really want to be aware of that. You don't want to push yourself beyond a healthy boundary or a healthy limit. You want to have a very balanced life, especially, for all the high school and college students out there. You have busy lives in school and your community and maybe a part-time job and your family. And I just want you to see volunteering not as a demand, not as something that you have to do to get into college, but as an experience that can really teach you about yourself too. To conclude, our next speaker is Dr. Preeti Paramil. I'm sorry, I'm probably botching this name. It's Thyparamil. Dr. Preeti graduated from New York University with a BA in biology and psychology before completing medical school at Columbia University. She's completed residency in ophthalmology and reconstructive surgery at Baylor College of Medicine. She is currently a faculty physician and assistant professor in ophthalmology at Northwestern University. So, sorry for not knowing how to pronounce her name, but she clearly sounds like a very accomplished woman, and I encourage you to visit her talk next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connie. That was great. I am thoroughly inspired. I actually have one question, and maybe you can expand on that a little further. So you mentioned your experience is both about, volunteering and getting involved in local causes, in local organizations across the country, but then also you did a few international ones in East Africa and then also in Mexico. Do you think that maybe you can summarize what your major challenges were in both of those scenarios? I know you said language was a big was an obstacle going into Mexico, but once you were there, it didn't seem that much of a challenge. But aside from the language, can you maybe just talk about some of the challenges that these young women should sort of, anticipate both locally and also if they're planning on doing some work internationally?
So with international context, I've worked in South Korea. I didn't volunteer there, but I worked in South Korea, and I've done research and volunteered in Mexico and East Africa. And obviously the cultural and language differences were sometimes immense. But I also think that in terms of local causes, people are like, well, was it easier to do stuff in the United States because I was raised here? The United States is so diverse, and the life experiences are so diverse that sometimes it can kind of shock you. Like the first time I worked with someone with severe mental health issues. Like, this was a while ago. I worked with a man who had paranoid schizophrenia, and his was quite severe. And so he constantly thought people were chasing him and that people were talking to him through television sets and the walls, and he wasn't sure if I was real. And so I just remember that, I couldn't relate to any of that. I had heard about the illness and disability, and I will just say that people with paranoid schizophrenia with medical treatment and medication can lead very productive lives, but he wasn't taking his medication. So sometimes you'll run into people, especially in very vulnerable populations, who express themselves or have lived experience very far removed from yours. And so that can be very shocking at first. And I think that be very selective on who you work with, knowing what you can handle, and being self-protective. Because sometimes another thing is that when you take care of someone, especially if they didn't have a parent to take care of them, they may become very attached to you very fast. And so I've had a number of especially children who got really attached to me really fast, like in the orphanage or in the group home. And I told them, I can't adopt you. They literally would ask me to adopt them. And so you have to be very careful about boundaries, what your role is. You are there as a volunteer. You are there for maybe 3 to 4 hours a week, no more. You do not take it home with you, and you can be very selective about how you interact with them, say on social media. Like, a lot of my clients have tried to friend request me, and I do not accept their friend requests. It is not because I don't want to be friends with them. I just think that separation is healthier for both of us. So I think boundaries, being aware of cultural and language differences, as well as being aware of people whose lived experience are very far removed from yours, are my major challenges. Sorry for that long answer, but yeah.
No, I think that was really helpful. Once again, thank you very much. This was a great talk. I think definitely a perspective that is very inspirational. So truly appreciate that. Thank you everyone for joining us on this very snowy Saturday afternoon. At least in New York, it's snowing. So hopefully not in California. But I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season. And we'll be back with Dr. Preeti in the new year. So stay tuned for her talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.